Kicking off with the Mirror now, and King Charles faces challenges at the start of his reign, Nick.
Yes, the Mirror have given him a few days' grace before pointing out his daunting task. They say Charles faces a series of daunting challenges as he begins his reign as king. And, of course, they list things like dealing with Andrew, the William and Harry saga, the general management of the Commonwealth, the perception of the cost of living crisis versus the sort of royal pomp, the modernising aspect, and living up, of course, to Her Majesty the Queen's legacy. So there's a few things worth highlighting for me. This thing about the cost of living crisis, the New York Times went with this as well, that like, oh, this is terrible because of the cost of living crisis to be doing all this. And there's a few things wrong with that. I mean, one, the cost is probably a fraction of things like the Liz Truss bailout package anyway.
Yep.
Also, it's my understanding that the Crown Estate revenue pays for this, not just directly from taxpayers' money. I could be wrong. The other thing I just note is that they talk about the Commonwealth countries that might want to remove the monarch as head of state. And this is the interesting thing where sort of lefties, particularly in America for some reason, seem to want to have a go at the Queen and talk about colonialism and all these things, whereas actually you could argue that the Queen's actually presided over the decline of the Commonwealth, and presumably Charles will continue to do the same.
Toby, what do you think? Is this quite a negative take on the new monarch, that he's going to have all these problems and this is going to be a really difficult reign for Charles?
Yeah, well, it does seem like quite a pessimistic take. And so far, you know, he seems to have not put a foot wrong. And one risk it highlights is that, you know, he tends to stick his oar in where it's not really wanted.
Yes.
Political matters.
Well, that's his reputation, isn't it?
That's his reputation, slightly interfering, oversteps the brief a little bit. But he hasn't done that so far, and he said he's going to put that stuff aside. So I think I'm a little bit more optimistic than this piece.
Well, I mean, particularly when it comes to issues such as climate change, where he has been very vocal, and of course, in that sense, you know, he has a disadvantage over the Queen because, of course, she was always kept herself to herself. But we've always known her as Queen. And Charles, of course, we've had many, many decades to know exactly what he thinks about various political issues. Yeah,
so that's a slight disadvantage. And I think he chose that as an issue because he thought it was not particularly politically contentious. All the major political parties agree on net zero. Now that people are the Conservatives are beginning to depart a little from that consensus, I think he needs to leave it alone for fear of getting involved in controversy.
I mean, Nick mentioned the cost of living crisis. And really, isn't this article sort of flagging that actually part of the challenge that he faces is that there's going to be a growing resentment, isn't there, in the country of very rich people who are very obviously very wealthy. But maybe people should be reserving that for the CEOs of the energy companies and that kind of thing, and not really... I mean, will it be the case that they will resent the royals in this regard?
I think people who are already prone to being Republicans will use this as a new thing to make their case. I question whether patriots who love the Queen and believe in the royal family will suddenly be annoyed at the cost. It will basically be whatever your side of the fence you're on, you'll use it, much like the Mirror are using it here because they're lefties. And the other thing they mention is the challenge of keeping the monarchy relevant in the 21st century. I'd rather it go the other way, in the 21st century go back to being...
You want it to be more traditional?
Yeah, let's go... Because they want to, you know, it's all the monarchy's got to modernise. No, why doesn't society go back a bit?
You mean like he should be beheading wives and that kind of thing?
Yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I see. What do you think, Toby?
One thing, in the section on reuniting his warring family, in which he talks about, the article talks about having to somehow breach the divide between Charles and Harry, between Harry and William, and it mentions Meghan's allegation that a member of the royal family had asked how dark her and Harry's first child would be, and that was apparently evidence that there was a racist member of the royal family. I recently saw Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle at the O2, and Chris Rock had a good bit about that, in which he said he didn't know a single black family with children that hadn't at some point speculated when the wife was pregnant as to what the colour of the baby's skin was going to be. He said black people speculate about that all the time, and when she said this and thought it was evidence of racism, that to him meant that was evidence she didn't have a single black friend, didn't know any black people
at all. But then, on the other hand, the royal family aren't black. So is it really, it's slightly different then, isn't it, black families speculating?
Well, but he thought if she'd have known any black people, she'd have known that speculating about the baby's colour was not evidence of racism.
But is it even his role to unite Harry and William? I mean, isn't that something that should be left to themselves, really?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think the royal family is doing a reasonable job of putting on a united front. And, you know, they've offered these royal titles, I think we're going to get to that in a bit, to the two children of Harry and Meghan. So, you know, they haven't got, I don't think, much to complain about.